03-12N, 175-38W, 2,000 miles west of Pearl Harbor in the obsidian throat of the Central Pacific, midnight, June 3, 1942. The air hung thick with fuel vapor and salt, a metallic miasma that clung to skin like cold sweat. Beneath the pitching deck of the USS Laffey, DD-459, deep in the ship's cramped electrical workshop, Ensign Elias Voss wiped grease from his spectacles with a rag already blackened beyond redemption. Around him, the destroyer groaned in its sleep. Steel flexing, pipes hissing, the distant thrum of twin General Electric turbines vibrating through the soles of his boots like the pulse of some exhausted leviathan. Outside, the ocean breathed in long, slow swells. Inside, time moved differently. Not in seconds, but in voltage drops, capacitor charges, the silent decay of tungsten filaments. Voss wasn't an officer in the grand sense. He held no command, issued no orders, attended no war councils. He was a reserve engineer from Toledo, Ohio, drafted not for his courage, but for his knack with vacuum tubes and timing circuits. Before the war, he'd repaired radios in a storefront with peeling green paint and a bell that jingled like a dying cricket. Now, aboard a Fletcher-class destroyer, racing toward an unseen enemy, his hands trembled not from fear, but from the low-frequency resonance of the ship's own heartbeat, a rhythm he'd begun to distrust. 2 nights earlier, during the chaotic retreat from the Battle of Midway, Voss had been summoned to the Combat Information Center after a radar anomaly flickered across the SG surface search display. A blip, faint, intermittent, had appeared 17 nautical miles off the starboard bow, vanished for 90 seconds, then reappeared in a position that defied trajectory logic. Lieutenant Commander Haskins dismissed it as ionospheric bounce, a ghost echo. But Voss, standing in the dim red glow of the plotting table, noticed something no one else had. The blip didn't just disappear, it stuttered. Its return wasn't smooth. It stuttered in precise, repeating intervals of 89.3 seconds, like a metronome wound too tight. He said nothing then. He never did. Instead, he returned to his workshop and began cross-referencing radar logs from the previous 72 hours. What he found chilled him more than the Pacific night air seeping through the ventilation shafts. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, Nakajima E-8N Daves, Aichi E-13A Jakes, were flying patterns not of search, but of calibration. Their flight paths weren't random sweeps. They were geometric, clockwork precise, circling at fixed altitudes for fixed durations before vanishing behind cloud banks, and every time they disappeared, radar contact dropped, sometimes for minutes. Voss realized with dawning horror that the enemy wasn't evading detection. They were synchronizing it. They discovered a flaw in the SG radar S-pulse repetition frequency, PURRF. At certain intervals, the radar's own pulse cycle created blind spots, microseconds of silence between transmissions during which a low-altitude aircraft could slip through undetected, like a thief stepping between the ticks of a clock. The flaw wasn't in the hardware, it was in the timing. The Navy had assumed radar was continuous, omniscient, but Voss, who once spent 3 days diagnosing why a Philco 89 radio skipped every 87th beat of a Glenn Miller record, understood rhythm better than most engineers understood calculus. He drafted a memo, not a report, too formal. Just 3 pages, typed on wrinkled mimeograph paper, with hand-drawn oscilloscope traces in the margins. He titled it, Temporal Gaps in SG Pulse Emission and Implications for Low-Altitude Target Acquisition. He delivered it personally to the ship's electronics officer, Lieutenant Garvey, who scanned it for 30 seconds before handing it back with a sigh that smelled of stale coffee and bourbon. Voss, we're not debugging jukeboxes out here. The radar works. The captain says so. The Bureau of Ships says so. Go tighten some capacitors and forget this. Voss didn't argue. He never argued. Instead, he He stayed up that night rewiring a spare ANAPS-2 airborne radar unit he de-salvaged from a crashed SOC Seagull floatplane. He cannibalized parts, a 6BA6 pentode tube from a sonar amplifier, a variable resistor from a damaged radio compass, even the quartz crystal from his own wristwatch, a Hamilton car key given to him by his father on his 21st birthday. He built a device that didn't transmit or receive. It listened, not to echoes but to the radar's own heartbeat, mapping its blind intervals like a cardiologist charting arrhythmia. By dawn on June 4th, the Laffey steamed into position northeast of Midway Atoll, part of a screen for Task Force 16. The sky turned rose gold, then blinding white. At 0430, General Quarters blared. Voss scrambled to his battle station but lingered near the radar shack, clutching his makeshift analyzer in a canvas satchel. At 0517, SG radar picked up inbound contacts, dozens of them, heading southeast at 200 knots. Japanese strike force. Voss watched the scope with the tension of a man waiting for his own name to be called at an execution. As the blips approached, he activated his device. A tiny green cathode ray tube flickered to life, tracing a jagged sine wave overlaid with vertical spikes, each spike marking the radar's transmission pulse. Between them, gaps. And as the Japanese bombers descended below 500 feet to avoid early detection, they timed their final approach to glide through those gaps, arriving over Midway just as the radar AS blind intervals aligned with their flight path. The attack began at 0545. Bombs fell, hangars burned. But Voss wasn't watching the island, he was watching the gaps. And in that moment, he knew. The enemy hadn't outsmarted American technology. They'd simply learned its rhythm and danced between its beats. He spent the next week in silence, speaking only to machines. The Laffey returned to Pearl for repairs after taking shrapnel near the aft torpedo tubes. While welders patched steel, Voss descended into the ship's engineering hold, where the heat pressed against his ribs like a living thing. There, by the glow of a single 25-watt bulb swinging on a chain, he built a second prototype, this one housed in a watertight aluminum case salvaged from a torpedo depth-setting mechanism. He called it the Chrono-Nullifier, though he never wrote the name down. Its purpose was simple: to insert microsecond delays into the SG radar's pulse train, shifting the blind spots randomly, unpredictably, making the radar's clock stutter in a way no enemy could anticipate. It violated every Navy regulation on signal integrity. It risked desynchronizing the entire radar network. But Voss calculated the risk. If the Japanese could exploit a 0.3-second gap every 90 seconds, then randomizing that gap by even plus 0.1 seconds would reduce detection vulnerability by over 96%. He tested it once, in the hold, using a hand-cranked signal generator and a dangling wire as an antenna. The oscilloscope showed chaos, beautiful, purposeful chaos. The rhythm was broken. Time, for the first time, was no longer the enemy's ally. He approached Commander Haskins again on June 12th, this time with oscilloscope photographs and a live demonstration on a bench-mounted SG simulator. Haskins, red-eyed from sleepless nights and bourbon rations, stared at the flickering display. "You're proposing we sabotage our own radar?" "It's not sabotage, sir. It's camouflage. Temporal camouflage." "Camouflage against time?" Haskins barked a laugh that echoed off the bulkheads like a cough. "Go back to your tubes, ensign, before I have you scrubbing bilges with a toothbrush." Voss saluted, turned, and walked away. But that night, while the ship lay moored at berth F7, he didn't sleep. He waited until the midwatch change, when the engineering watchstander dozed over a crossword puzzle. Then, with a screwdriver wrapped in rubber tape to muffle sound, he opened the SG radar S timing control panel on the main deck and spliced in his Chrono-Nullifier, not as an override, just as a whisper in the machine's ear. He set it to activate only during low-altitude scan mode, the setting used against torpedo bombers. He didn't seek permission. He didn't file a report. He simply gave the radar a new heartbeat, one that skipped, stumbled, and lied. And when he climbed back to his bunk, exhausted but calm, he knew that if anyone discovered what he'd done, he'd be court-martialed for tampering with critical combat systems. But if no one discovered it, and if it worked, then perhaps time itself would forget his name. And that, he thought as the harbour lights shimmered on the oily water outside his porthole, was exactly how it should be. July 19th, 1942, latitude 12°08 N, longitude 134°41 E, the Philippine Sea, east of Luzon. Monsoon season had draped the ocean in a shroud of warm mist, the kind that clung to metal and turned radar lenses into fogged spectacles. Aboard the USS Nicholas, DD-449, Ensign Elias Voss crouched in the forward electronics locker, sweat tracing lines through the grime on his temples. He'd been reassigned after Pearl, not as punishment, but as obscurity. The Laffey's radar log showed no anomalies during his unauthorized modification. No officers filed complaints. The Chrono-Nullifier remained hidden behind a false panel. In the SG timing unit, its wires soldered with surgical precision, its existence known only to the hum of capacitors and the silent pulse of quartz. Yet Voss couldn't rest, because in the weeks following Midway, decrypted JN-25 messages intercepted by Station Hypo hinted at something deeper. Japanese naval aviation units were refining their low-altitude strike profiles, shortening approach windows, synchronizing dives with astonishing temporal discipline. They weren't just exploiting radar gaps, they were building entire attack doctrines around them, and if the flaw persisted across the Pacific Fleet's surface search radars, then every convoy, every task force, every carrier group remained vulnerable to a ghost in the machine. Voss had brought his notes with him, encoded not in cipher but in mundane engineering shorthand, diagrams labeled oscillation dampening trials or power supply ripple correction. On the Nicholas, he found a reluctant ally-in-chief, Petty Officer Marlowe, a wiry sonar technician with a missing left pinky and a hatred for brass hat assumptions. Marlowe didn't understand vacuum tubes, but he understood silence, the kind that preceded a torpedo wake in the dead of night. One evening, while the ship patrolled the approaches to Guadalcanal, Voss showed him the Chrono-Nullifier prototype. "It doesn't make us invisible," Voss explained, voice low over the rumble of the diesel generators. "It just makes our blindness unpredictable." Marlowe grunted, ran a calloused thumb over the device's aluminum casing. "So the Japs can't time their dives like a damn metronome?" "Exactly. Then why ain't it on every radar in the fleet?" Voss looked away, out the porthole at the phosphorescent wake curling behind the destroyer. "Because nobody believes time can be weaponized." But belief wasn't the point, not yet. Evidence was, and Voss needed a controlled test under combat-like conditions. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On August 7th, 1942, the Nicholas joined the screen for the invasion of Guadalcanal. As transports unloaded Marines onto the beaches of Lunga Point, Japanese air raids descended with clockwork fury, Mitsubishi G4M Bettys sweeping in from the north at wave-top altitude, engines throttled to near idle, their approach timed to coincide with the radar's pulse. Intervals as extrapolated from Midway data. At 14:22, SG radar on the Nicholas picked up a formation 38 miles out. Standard procedure dictated vectoring cap, combat air patrol, once the blip stabilized. But the contacts flickered, strong at 38, gone at 32, reappeared at 27, too erratic for jamming, too rhythmic for clutter. Voss, stationed in CIC as a backup radar technician, watched the scope with the stillness of a man witnessing his own prophecy unfold. The Japanese were using the gaps, again. Without authorization, he slipped into the Radar Shack during a shift change and activated the Chrono-Nullifier's field test unit, a smaller, battery-powered version he'd assembled in secret. It didn't alter the radar's output power or frequency. It merely injected randomized micro-delays into the pulse repetition interval, shifting the blind spots by fractions of a second in a non-repeating sequence. For the next 17 minutes, as the Betis closed in, Voss monitored both the SG display and his oscilloscope feed. The enemy blips no longer vanished predictably. They stuttered erratically, sometimes holding steady, sometimes flickering out for 0.4 seconds, then reappearing off-axis. Confusion rippled through CIC. "Why's that Betty bouncing like a stone on water?" a lieutenant muttered. "Is the gyro stabilizer failing?" "No, sir," Voss replied quietly. "It's the enemy that's unstable now." At 14:39, the Betis broke formation, their low-altitude run disrupted by contradictory radar returns. Some pilots, expecting to slip through a known blind spot, instead found themselves painted by radar beams they couldn't anticipate. Wildcat fighters, scrambled late but guided by erratic but persistent contacts, intercepted them 12 miles from the transport anchorage. 3 Betis went down in flames, 2 jettisoned bombs prematurely and fled. 0 American ships were hit. After the raid, damage control teams reported minor shrapnel wounds, but no structural damage, remarkable for a daylight raid over a beachhead. In his log, the Nicholas's radar operator noted, "Unusual contact behavior observed, possibly due to atmospheric ducting or equipment drift." Voss said nothing. He retrieved his test unit, wiped the condensation from its casing, and stowed it beneath his bunk. But Marlowe saw him, and Marlowe remembered. Word of the Nicholas's lucky radar performance reached Admiral Gormley's staff in Noumea. Not as innovation, but as anecdote. Yet in the labyrinthine corridors of naval intelligence, anecdotes sometimes found ears hungry for patterns. Lieutenant Commander Alan Driscoll, an eccentric signals analyst attached to OP-20G, had been collating reports of intermittent target dropout across the South Pacific since May. Most were dismissed as operator error or ionospheric interference, but Driscoll, a former physics instructor with a penchant for Fourier transforms, noticed something. The dropout intervals clustered around multiples of 89.2 seconds, exactly the PRF of the SG radar. He requested radar logs from the Nicholas. When Voss's name appeared repeatedly in maintenance annotations, always paired with phrases like timing calibration or pulse stability check, Driscoll sent a coded teletype. Request. Temporary assignment of Ensign Voss, USNR, to Naval Research Laboratory Detachment, Espiritu Santo. Priority Alpha. Voss arrived on Espiritu Santo on September 3, 1942, under a sky bruised purple by twilight thunderstorms. The NRL detachment occupied a cluster of Quonset huts near Seagan Channel, surrounded by coconut palms and the constant drone of mosquitoes. Driscoll greeted him not with rank or salutes, but with a stack of oscillograms and a single question. "Did you break time?" Voss hesitated, then nodded. In the next 48 hours, in a lab lit by kerosene lanterns and powered by a sputtering generator, they tested the Chrono-Nullifier against a captured Japanese Type 22 radar and a simulated SG array. Driscoll ran statistical models on a mechanical calculator that clicked like a dying clock. The results were undeniable. Randomized pulse staggering reduced low-altitude detection vulnerability by 93.7%. "You didn't just patch a flaw," Driscoll murmured, staring at the printout. "You turned their precision against them." But approval was another matter. The Bureau of Ships in Washington dismissed the findings as speculative engineering with unacceptable risk to fleet-wide radar synchronization. Rear Admiral Harold Bowen, head of the Naval Research Laboratory, overruled them, but only for a limited field trial. 3 destroyers, O'Bannon, Chevalier, and Strong would receive modified SG units with integrated chrono-nullifiers before the November offensive in the Solomons. Voss was ordered to supervise installation. He worked through nights, calibrating each unit by hand, tuning the randomization algorithm to avoid harmonics that might interfere with IFF signals. On November 12th, as the ships steamed toward Guadalcanal for the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Voss stood on the O'Bannon's bridge wing, watching rain sheet down the Pacific. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even on the manifest. But in the radar room below, his creation hummed, shifting its blind spots like a living thing, unpredictable, elusive, alive. That night, Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima approached Savo Sound to shell Henderson Field. Their accompanying destroyers launched torpedo attacks under cover of darkness. But this time, American radar didn't blink at regular intervals. It blinked like a nervous eye, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, never the same twice. The O'Bannon detected a group of destroyers closing at 18 knots, 14 miles out, despite their low silhouette and rain cover. Gunnery officers opened fire before visual contact. One Japanese destroyer, Akatsuki, was caught in searchlights and shredded by 5-inch shells within minutes. Post-battle analysis would credit radar performance for the early detection that turned the tide of the engagement. No one mentioned pulse staggering. No one mentioned Voss. And as the O'Bannon limped away with a dented bow and 17 dead, Voss sat in the electronics bay, listening to the Chrono-Nullifier's faint electrical whine, knowing that time, for once, had been on their side. January 17th, 1943, 05°31'S, 153-19E, off the coast of New Britain, in the rain-lashed waters of the Bismarck Sea. The USS Perkins, DD-377, sliced through swells the color of wet gunmetal, its bow throwing arcs of foam that vanished instantly into the pre-dawn gloom. Inside the ship's forward radar shack, Petty Officer 3rd Class Felix Rourke, newly transferred from Pearl Harbor, green as seaweed but sharp-eyed, adjusted the gain on the SG radar scope and frowned. The blip was there, then not, then there again, but not in the jagged, chaotic way atmospheric interference usually produced. This flicker had a cadence, a syncopation that felt almost deliberate. He tapped the screen. "Sergeant, you seeing this?" Chief Radarman Bellows grunted without looking up from his logbook. "Probably just the damn thing's acting up again. That new timing mod's been glitching since Espiritu Santo." "It's not glitching," Rourke insisted. "It's hunting." Unbeknownst to either man, Elias Voss stood 2 decks below in the engineering hold, elbows deep in a tangle of coaxial cables and vacuum tube sockets, installing his 3rd-generation Chrono-Nullifier into the Perkins's backup SG unit. The field trial had expanded after the November battles around Guadalcanal, where modified destroyers consistently detected low-flying Bettys and Vals earlier than their unmodified counterparts. The NRL had quietly authorized retrofits on 24 ships across the South Pacific Fleet. Voss, now listed as a special technical advisor with no formal rank upgrade, had spent the last 2 months moving from hull to hull, by destroyer, by tender, by flying boat, carrying his tools in a dented metal case, stenciled with the innocuous label Radar Timing Calibration Kit, Macaire III. He no longer sought permission. He arrived, worked through the night, tested, and left before dawn. Captains signed his requisition slips without reading them. Engineers assumed he was from Bueships, and the radar operators, those who noticed the change, simply learned to trust the scope again. But the Japanese hadn't stopped adapting. Radio intercepts from Frumel in Melbourne indicated that Imperial Navy aviation units were now training with radar rhythm. Maps, charts plotting the expected blind intervals of American SG and SC radars based on captured technical manuals and observed behavior during earlier raids. They were teaching pilots to ride the gaps, like surfers catching waves, timing their descent to coincide with microseconds of electronic silence. What had begun as empirical observation in the skies over Midway had crystallized into doctrine, and Voss knew if the enemy believed time was fixed, predictable, then the only defense was to make time itself untrustworthy. On the Perkins, he finished the installation just as the ship entered the patrol zone for Operation Dexterity, the Allied campaign to isolate Rabaul. Rain drummed on the deck above like distant gunfire. He climbed to the bridge to observe the first live test. At 0641, Lookout spotted a lone Aichi E-13A Jake floatplane circling 28 miles to the northwest. Standard Japanese reconnaissance behavior before a convoy attack. The SG radar locked on immediately, but instead of fading in and out at regular intervals, the blip danced, vanishing for 0.27 seconds, reappearing off its projected vector, then stuttering twice in rapid succession. Flight deck officers muttered in confusion. "That thing's possessed," someone said. But CIC held contact, and when the Perkins vectored a Wildcat from the escort carrier Chenango, the pilot reported maintaining radar lock all the way to visual range, a rarity against low-altitude scouts. The Jake never saw it coming. It went down in a gout of orange flame and black oil, its radio silenced before it could report the convoy's position. That evening, in the cramped wardroom, Voss ate cold beans from a can and listened to the ship's captain. A grizzled veteran of the Java Sea praised the improved reliability of the new radar tuning. No one mentioned temporal manipulation. No one needed to. The proof was in the silence of the enemy's radio net. Over the next 3 weeks, as the Perkins escorted convoys through the treacherous waters between Milne Bay and Leh, Japanese air attacks dropped by 68%. Reconnaissance sightings fell by 81%. The pattern was unmistakable to those who knew where to look, but to the admirals in Brisbane and Washington, it was just another statistic in the slow grind of attrition. Then came the night of February 28th. The Perkins and 3 other destroyers, Smith, Lambson and Mahoney, were screening a slow convoy of Liberty ships carrying artillery and marines to Finschhafen. Intelligence warned of a major Japanese air response. At 21:14, radar picked up a formation of 12 G4M Bettys approaching from the northwest at 150 feet, engines muffled, running dark. Standard procedure would have given the escorts barely 4 minutes warning. But the Chrono-Nullifiers aboard all 4 destroyers had been synchronized that afternoon using a shared pseudo-random seed, a sequence Voss had hand-calculated to avoid intership interference, while maximizing collective unpredictability. As the Bettys descended into the expected blind zones, they found only chaos. One bomber, expecting silence at 22.3 seconds into its run, instead flew straight into a radar pulse it couldn't anticipate. The Smith opened fire at 11 miles. The Perkins launched star shells. In the sudden glare, the Bettys scattered like startled birds, their formation shattered. 4 were shot down before they released ordnance. The rest jettisoned bombs and fled into the storm front to the east. Not a single Allied ship was scratched. Afterward, Voss stood alone on the fantail, the salt wind drying the oil streaks on his hands. He watched the dying embers of a Betty's wreckage swirl in the ship's wake, extinguished by the cold Pacific. He thought of the pilot, some nameless man from Kyushu who'd trained for months to master the rhythm of American radar, only to find that rhythm had been unmade. There was no triumph in it, only sorrow. War wasn't won by heroes, he realized. It was won by those who made the familiar strange, the predictable alien, the certain uncertain. And in doing so, they broke more than machines. They broke the enemy's faith in the world's order, but institutional inertia is a tide harder to turn than any ocean current. Back in Washington, the Bureau of Ships remained skeptical. Anecdotal success does not constitute engineering validation, read a memo stamped confidential and filed under radar timing anomalies, unverified. Rear Admiral Bowen fought for wider deployment. But supply chains, standardization protocols, and the sheer bureaucracy of wartime production moved with the sluggishness of a battleship in dry dock. Meanwhile, Voss received a new order: report to the naval shipyard at Mare Island by March 15th. Not for commendation, for reassignment. The official reason? Administrative realignment of technical personnel. The unspoken truth: his unofficial tinkering had drawn too much quiet attention. Better to bury the man than risk the controversy of his method. He boarded a transport out of Espiritu Santo on March 3rd. As the ship cleared the harbor, he looked back at the jungle-covered hills, the anti-aircraft batteries, the rusting hulks of sunken freighters. He left behind no nameplate, no manual, no patent, only a handful of modified radar units humming in the bellies of destroyers, their secret ticking away in microseconds. And in his pocket a single sheet of paper, his final Chrono-Nullifier schematic, folded so many times it threatened to tear. He didn't know it yet, but the war wasn't done with him. Because 3,000 miles away, in a submarine pen near Kure, a Japanese engineer named Kenjiro Sato was puzzling over why his radar silence charts no longer matched reality, and beginning to suspect that the Americans had found a way to stop time itself. March 28, 1943, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, California. Fog clung to the Carquinez Strait like wet gauze, muffling the clang of rivet guns and the groan of dry dock cranes. Inside Building 67, a low, windowless structure labeled Electronics Overhaul. Division Delta, Ensign Elias Voss sat at a scarred oak desk, filling out Form N247, request for reassignment of non-essential technical personnel. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been pulled from the front lines not because his work failed, but because it succeeded too quietly. No medals, no debriefings. Just a transfer to a stateside desk, tasked with calibrating training oscilloscopes for new radar operators who would never know the names of the machines they inherited. He wore a clean khaki uniform now, sleeves buttoned, cap squared, but his hands still twitched with the memory of soldering iron heat, of coaxial cables stripped with his teeth in pitch-black radar shacks, of the faint ozone smell when a 6BA6 tube fired true. The Chrono-Nullifier hadn't vanished. Through back channels, chiefly, Driscoll and a sympathetic lieutenant in the office of the Chief of Naval Operations, modified SG units, continued to appear on new Fletcher-class destroyers rolling off the Seattle-Tacoma shipbuilding lines. But the innovation remained uncodified, undocumented in official manuals, absent from training syllabi. It existed only in whispers. Make sure the timing's randomized on the SG before you deploy, a senior chief might murmur to a junior technician during sea trials. The Japs have gotten real good at counting our pulses. Yet without formal adoption, the system was fragile, dependent on individual memory, prone to being corrected by overzealous engineers who saw the erratic pulse pattern as a malfunction to be fixed, not a feature to be preserved. Voss tried to write a proper technical report. He drafted it 3 times, each version more precise, more clinically detached, stripping away every trace of narrative or speculation. He cited oscilloscope data, probability distributions, engagement outcomes from the Bismarck Sea convoy battles. He submitted it to the Naval Research Laboratory. It was returned 2 weeks later with a single-line annotation in red pencil: lacks theoretical foundation. Recommend pursuit of conventional jamming countermeasures. He stared at those words for a long time, then fed the pages into the shipyard's sheet metal incinerator, watching the edges curl to black before vanishing into ash. But the war has a way of resurrecting the useful, regardless of protocol. On April 17th, a coded dispatch arrived from Admiral Nimitz's headquarters in Pearl. Request immediate technical consultation regarding anomalous radar performance during recent engagement near Truk. Suspected Japanese counter-radar tactics. Priority Zebra. Attached was a list of ship names: Charrett, Connor, Stansbury, all vessels known to Voss as Chrono-Nullifier installations. Someone somewhere had connected the dots. He boarded a C-54 bound for Hawaii on April 19th. Over the Pacific, Watching cloud banks drift below like frozen waves, he allowed himself a rare moment of hope. Not for recognition, never that, but for validation. For the chance to prove that observation, not doctrine, could bend the arc of battle. He arrived at Pearl on April 21st, just as typhoon season began to stir the western Pacific. The meeting took place in a soundproofed room beneath Sinsipak headquarters, walls lined with cork and blackout curtains drawn tight. Present were Admiral Spruance's intelligence chief, a MIT-trained radar physicist from the radiation laboratory, and Lieutenant Commander Driscoll, now gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of decoding Japanese signals traffic. They laid out the problem, beginning in March. Japanese surface raiders, light cruisers and destroyers, had begun executing night torpedo attacks with uncanny precision, slipping past destroyer screens undetected until point-blank range. Standard radar showed nothing. Sonar picked up nothing, yet ships were hit. Unless they've developed stealth hulls, the Rad Lab physicist said dryly. They're exploiting a blind spot we don't understand. Voss listened in silence as they debated ionospheric ducting, magnetron degradation, even sabotage. Then he spoke, voice low but steady. They're not evading radar. They're evading time. He explained his theory. The Japanese, frustrated by the failure of their airborne low-altitude tactics, had turned to surface forces. Using captured SG technical data, or perhaps reverse engineering from downed aircraft electronics, they'd calculated the exact pulse intervals of American surface search radars. Now their destroyers were running silent intervals during maneuvers, cutting engines, drifting, timing their torpedo launches to coincide with radar blind spots. It wasn't magic. It was arithmetic. And you believe randomizing the pulse train would disrupt this? Spruance's chief asked. It already has, Voss replied. On the ships I modified. Check their logs. They haven't lost a single convoy to surface torpedo attacks since January. A pause. Then Driscoll slid a folder across the table. Inside were action reports from the O'Bannon, Perkins, and Charrett. All confirmed 0 successful torpedo strikes during nighttime surface engagements in Chrono-Nullifier-equipped vessels. Unmodified ships in the same task forces reported multiple near misses. The decision was made in under an hour. Under Spruance's direct authority, every SG radar in the Central Pacific Fleet would be retrofitted with pulse randomization circuits within 60 days. Voss would oversee the program. Not as an advisor. As lead engineer, authorization stamped by Nimitz himself, he worked 18-hour days for the next month. In the sweltering holds of tenders at Majuro, aboard cruisers at Eniwetok, even on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, during a lull in strikes against the Marianas. Voss and a team of hand-picked technicians installed the final iteration of the Chrono-Nullifier, now hardened. Standardized and labeled Pulse Stagger Unit marked the fun to satisfy bureaucratic sensibilities. He trained chief engineers to maintain it, wrote a 10-page operational guide stripped of all personal reference, and ensured the randomization algorithm could be updated via punch tape. If the Japanese ever adapted again, the true test came on. June 19, 1943, the opening night of the Battle of the Philippine Sea, as TAC Force 58 steamed west of Saipan. Radar picked up a surface contact 24 miles out, identified as a Kagero-class destroyer, closing fast. Standard procedure would have held fire until visual confirmation. But the SG radar aboard the Buchanan, DD-484, equipped with the Mark I unit, maintained erratic but continuous contact. The destroyer's skipper, Commander James Renshaw, trusted the scope. At 22:07, he ordered a spread of 5 torpedoes, launched from 18,000 yards, unheard of for a surface engagement. 3 hit. The Japanese destroyer, Isakaze, broke in half and sank in under 4 minutes. Post-action interrogation of survivors revealed the truth. The crew had executed a textbook radar gap run, cutting engines at 22:05, expecting 90 seconds of invisibility. Instead, they were painted continuously, their timing shattered by randomized pulses they couldn't anticipate. By July 1943, Japanese surface night attacks in the Central Pacific had ceased entirely. Naval intelligence assessed the shift as tactical withdrawal due to attrition. Only a handful of men knew the real reason. Time itself had become an unreliable ally for the enemy. And in a small office at Pearl Harbor, Elias Voss quietly filed his final report, then burned his personal notes. Fame was a current he refused to swim in. Let the victory belong to the fleet, to the captains, to the doctrine manuals. He had only ever wanted the radar to see what was there, not what it expected to see. October 12, 1945, San Diego Naval Base. The war had been over for 2 months, but the ocean still carried its ghosts in the salt and the silence between ship horns. Elias Voss stood on the pier in civilian clothes, a wool coat too heavy for the California autumn, trousers pressed but fraying at the cuffs, watching stevedores unload crates from the USS Dewey, DD-349. He hadn't returned to active duty after VJ Day. His reassignment paperwork had simply expired. No one called him back. No one needed him anymore. The Chrono-Nullifier, now formally designated the PS-1 Pulse Stagger Unit, was standard equipment on every U.S. surface combatant. Its design declassified and licensed to Westinghouse and General Electric. Manuals described it as an evolution of radar timing protocols developed through collaborative fleet testing. His name appeared nowhere. Not in patents, not in after-action reports, not even in the footnotes of the Naval Research Laboratory's official history. He'd signed a non-disclosure affidavit in April 1944 and never spoken of it since. He walked past the dry docks, past sailors on liberty laughing with girls in bright dresses, past the skeletal frames of ships being scrapped before they'd fired a shot in anger. At the edge of the base, a Navy surplus store sold khaki shirts, dented canteens, and declassified radar training films. In the window, mounted on a wooden stand, was an SG radar control panel, stripped of tubes, its dials frozen at 0. A sign read, Pacific Theater Relic 25. Voss stared at it for a long time. He could have rebuilt it in an afternoon. He could have made it see through rain, through darkness, through the arrogance of certainty. But he turned away. Some machines were meant to rest. He took a bus to downtown San Diego and checked into a rooming house near the trolley line. The landlady, a widow whose son had died at Tarawa, eyed his quiet demeanor and thin suitcase and gave him the corner room with a view of the harbor. That night he sat by the open window, listening to the foghorn from Point Loma, a slow, mournful bellow that echoed the rhythm of a ship's heartbeat. He thought of the Laffey, the Nicholas, the Perkins, hulls he'd walked, circuits he'd touched, blind spots he'd broken. He thought of the Japanese pilot over the Bismarck Sea, falling into fire because time betrayed him. He felt no pride. Only the weight of what had been necessary and the quiet relief that it was done. A week later, a letter arrived from MIT's radiation laboratory. It was an invitation, formal, respectful, to join a new project on adaptive signal processing for post-war civilian applications. They'd heard rumors, not from official channels, but from engineers who'd served on modified destroyers and never forgotten the radar that lied to the enemy. The salary was generous. The work was cutting edge. Voss read it 3 times. Then he wrote a single line in reply, "I'm done altering time. I'd like to live in it now." He found work instead at a small radio repair shop in National City. The owner, a Czech immigrant named Kovac who'd fled Prague in '38, didn't care about Voss's past, only that he could fix a Philco 46600 without schematics. Customers came with static-filled zeniths, cracked bakelite cases, tubes that hissed like snakes. Voss worked slowly, methodically, his fingers moving with the same precision they'd used to splice radar timing lines under shell fire. Children sometimes watched through the shop window, mesmerized by the green glow of his oscilloscope. He never explained what it did. Years passed. The shop remained unchanged. The war receded into newsreels and Memorial Day parades. In 1952, the Navy released a public documentary on radar innovation in the Pacific. It featured interviews with admirals, scientists from Bell Labs, footage of SC and SG arrays sweeping the horizon. There was no mention of Pulse Staggering's irregular origins. No mention of a reserve ensign who listened to the silence between blips and heard a flaw the experts dismissed as noise. Voss watched it alone in the shop after hours, the projector whirring on a folding chair, the screen casting long shadows on shelves of vacuum tubes. When it ended, he turned off the machine, wiped the lens with a microfiber cloth, and went home. He never married, never owned a car. But every November 3rd, he remembered the date without knowing why. He walked to the waterfront and stood near the USS Midway Memorial, watching the gulls wheel over the bay. He'd think of Midway not as a turning point in history, but as a moment in a radar room. The flicker of a blip, the stutter of a pulse. The instant he realized that certainty was the enemy's greatest weapon, and that the only defense was to make the world less certain. In 1967, during the height of the Cold War, a declassified Naval Electronics Laboratory report finally acknowledged the unconventional timing, modifications that had reduced low-altitude detection, vulnerability by over 90% in 1943-44. It cited anonymous fleet-level innovations and recommended further study of non-periodic emission strategies for anti-stealth applications. Voss read the summary in Proceedings magazine at the public library. He closed the journal, returned it to the shelf, and bought a cup of coffee from a diner across the street. The waitress, young and bright-eyed, asked if he wanted cream. He smiled faintly. Just black. Like the sea at midnight. He died in his sleep on January 14, 1983, aged 71. His obituary in the San Diego Union listed him as a radio technician and veteran of World War II. No cause of death was given. No survivors named. His belongings, a few books, a Hamilton wristwatch with a cracked crystal, a box of vacuum tubes labeled in careful script, were donated to a technical college. Among them was a small aluminum cylinder unmarked, its interior lined with hand-soldered circuits and a single quartz crystal. A student plugged it into an oscilloscope out of curiosity. The display flickered, then traced a waveform that never repeated, shifting, elusive, impossible to predict. The student frowned, then shrugged and tossed it into a drawer labeled MISC Components. Today, every modern radar, from Aegis destroyers to airport weather arrays, uses some form of pulse staggering or frequency agility to defeat jamming and stealth. The principle is textbook. The origin is footnote. But in the quiet hum of a ship's combat system, in the microseconds between pulses, in the blind spots that no longer exist because someone once dared to break time, Elias Voss remains. Not as a name, but as a whisper in the machine. A testament to the ordinary who saw what others ignored, who acted when institutions hesitated, who changed the course of war not with a shout, but with a silence that moved. And in that silence, the sea keeps its secrets and its saviors.